Welcome to this session on bulletproofing your story. My name is Nils Hansson. I'm a former editor at Swedish television, but nowadays I'm a freelance journalist. In this session, you will get very concrete tips on how to stay out of trouble by having a systematic approach in your reporting. And my perspective will be the editors and the reporters, but there is another crucial perspective to discuss, and that is the attorneys, the legal perspective. So I'm glad to present my partner in this session, Alinda Vermeer. Hello.
Thanks, Niels.
Alinda.
I'm Alinda Vermeer. I'm CEO at Media Defense. Media Defense is an organization that works globally to defend journalists' rights. So whenever they get into legal trouble as a result of their work, we can help them. In my former life, I worked as a lawyer, including representing journalists before regional courts around the world. Before we get started, perhaps let's set some ground rules. Niels and I both aim to be speaking for around 25 minutes. Then we'll have around 20 minutes for Q&A. And if you have any questions about specific legal issues that you might be facing, and you may not want to discuss those with everyone listening or with your question being recorded and shared with the public, then do feel free to reach out to me after the presentation. I'll share my contact details, so you'll have those at hand. Finally, any information that we share during this presentation doesn't constitute legal advice and isn't taken as legal advice. It's always a good idea to consult a local lawyer if you get into legal trouble as a result of your work. So without further ado, let me hand over to Niels so you can get started on your presentation.
Thank you, Alinda. I will try to share my screen now and start this presentation about bulletproofing your story. Bulletproofing, that's an American expression, but I think that's a very good expression about what it's all about. So why bulletproof your story? Well, there are many reasons. I will just give you two reasons here. Here's one reason. Well, you don't want to end up as the bad guy yourself. But I mean, it can happen to the best, which some of these examples shows. Experienced, awarded, investigative journalists have ended up in serious problems, and you don't want to do that, do you? And here's another reason to bulletproof your story. You really don't want to be sleepless the whole night before publication, having a cold sweat, thinking, did I get everything right? Maybe I'm totally wrong. You don't want to experience that, do you? So how to avoid this? Well, the answer, as far as I can see, you need to have a system for quality control. That's the answer. This is the name of the TV show I have been working for. I was the editor-in-chief for 14 years at this newsroom with this TV program. And during all these years, we developed a system for quality control. And I can assure you, we wouldn't have survived if we didn't have this system of quality control. By the way, the name in English is much better, Mission Investigate. In Swedish, it is Uppdrag Granskning, rather clumsy name. But Mission Investigate, sometimes we say Mission Impossible, because sometimes you feel it is really impossible mission we have. And our system of quality control is quite simple. It's 3 checkpoints: the start meeting in the beginning, and then in the middle, the midpoint meeting, and then at the end, the line-by-line fact-checking meeting. This might seem to be a little bit of a bureaucratic approach to investigative journalism, but I can assure you it pays off. And even if you don't want to adapt everything I'm talking about now, maybe it will give you some inspiration when it comes to quality control. And here we have a central figure in our system of quality control, the devil's advocate. It's a role played by an editor or a reporter or a program host willing to challenge their colleagues. This is quite a demanding assignment, which also demands some research to be well prepared before these checkpoints. The start meeting, of course, is the meeting where we say yes or no to an idea. The reporters or the team have done some pre-research, and I believe they have a great story. And now we have the decision to make. Is it worth investing in? And at this meeting, the editor-in-chief is participating, the team and the editorial team and the devil's advocate. And this meeting can take around 60 to 90 minutes. One important
Niels,
item.
Can I just interrupt you there?
Yes.
Sorry about that. Is there a way in which you can share your presentation full screen?
Oh, it's not full screen now?
No, we are seeing it quite small.
Okay. That's too bad. Maybe I just have to go down here and down here. And now it's full screen.
No, that still doesn't seem to be working. Shall we try unshare or stop sharing and share again?
Yeah, stop share. Okay, and then that's good that you did note maybe the share screen, and I get into this picture and I share. And
that's better.
You can see it's better.
Yes, that's perfect.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you, Linda. Okay. Every story has a weak link, but the problem is that the team tends to neglect this weak link. And another thing, at this early stage, we have to be very humble because there's so many things we don't know about, unknown circumstances and documents and so on. And that's why we need to be very humble, and that's why we need this devil's advocate with a mission to kill the story. And of course, being devil's advocate, it does mean that you have to ask all those critical questions the team does not want to hear, often taking the perspective of the bad guy, the subject of the investigation, saying that the evidence is not convincing, your sources seems to be weak, or there might be other explanations. And this can cause some tense moments during the meeting, but it's done with the best of intentions. You have to remember that. Here is a really essential item on the checklist: accountability. This is something we have to discuss from the very beginning, how to demand accountability. We have to make up a plan. And I can say, for us, the general rule is the sooner, the better. And the advantages are very clear, because this means that, you cannot be sure you have a story until you have been listening to the other side of their explanations. And to get the explanations at a very late stage, well, that could be a nightmare and end up with deep problems with deadlines and so on. So if you get explanations and the response early on, then we have time to examine the explanations. But there are exceptions, of course, where early contact should be avoided. And I will come back to that later. Now, let's get to the second checkpoint, which is more like a, should we say, a quality meeting. Takes around 1 hour. We are discussing quality issues like these. When it comes to the conclusion, an investigation without a conclusion is not much of an investigation. We have to make conclusions out of our research. But we also have to make sure that all other explanations can be excluded, that there are no other explanations. And we also have to discuss the findings we have. Can they be questioned in any way? Then we have this interesting question of the big picture, the overall impression. are we giving a fair and balanced story? And this is something that we should discuss much more, I think, among us investigative journalists. Because fact is, you can't tell true facts without telling the truth. And one of the biggest problems with investigative journalists, as far as I can see, maybe the biggest problem, by the way, is that investigative reporters tend to get hit by tunnel vision. At the end of the tunnel, they see this great story, great success with great impact. They maybe even can see awards. So now it's only a question of getting the evidence needed. So the only interest the reporters have is to get evidence, to get the story proved. And they are not so interested in contradicting facts, the mitigating circumstances, and so on. And the consequence can be a seriously misleading story, although all the facts are accurate. So how to deal with this? How to make sure we include all relevant facts? I mean, that is really mission impossible. But I think we have some interesting questions to ask ourselves in this process, some delicate questions that can help us to make sure that we get all the relevant facts into the story. This is the first question. Would other facts change the general picture? It's very easy for the reporters to say no to that. But this one is more challenging, more tricky. Would the public be disappointed if they knew what we had left out? And you really don't want to disappoint your own public, do you? So that's a good question. But I have a third question that is even more challenging and even more difficult. Can we justify the selection without losing credibility? Think about the situation that you are confronted by a media critical investigative reporter stating that you have presented a misleading story and have not included relevant facts. Can you, at this moment, during this interview, justify the selection without losing that credibility you really need to have as an investigative reporter? Can you do that? Think about that question. That's a tough question and a good question to ask yourself. And the same goes for the experts. We are experts on selecting experts, saying the right things, saying the things we want to say, and sometimes make the conclusions that we cannot make ourselves. But the question is the expert representative? Is the expert up to date on the subject? And can someone else, someone maybe a more heavy expert, contradict this? And what we don't want to happen is that suddenly another expert pops up stating that your expert is totally wrong. We don't want to experience that, do we? And the same when it comes to the victims. Are the sources, are they trustworthy? I think that not asking the critical, relevant questions to the victims, I think that's a cardinal mistake among investigative reporters. Which means that it's like you don't believe they can handle tough questions, so you don't ask them. But by not asking them, you are almost betraying the victim and the public, because the public will ask those questions anyhow. And in fact, both your credibility and the victim's credibility will be gained by asking those tough, relevant, critical questions. And of course, make sure that you've done the necessary background, check the background. And if you don't do that, well, maybe this person has written something on social media that really blows away all credibility, or maybe this victim has a criminal background, criminal record. And that's something you should know before you publish the story, not afterwards. Let's get into the accountability and the fairness. We always say that we are accurate and fair as if it was a given. But are we really fair? And I think this is something you should discuss during the whole process. We do it of course, it is midpoint meeting, because this is so important. How do we treat other people? We're dealing with people, even if they are bad guys. Are we fair against the bad guys? I think that could be a question. I think we could compare with the judicial system, the legal system, where the accused person must be given access to evidence to prepare the case in court in good time. At least a working judicial system should work this way. But compare that to the editorial system, which often means that the accused person gets a minimum of information at a very late stage. Is that fair play? Is that fair play? I don't think so. I give you a tragical example from Sweden. This is a case of famous theater director committing suicide after being investigated by the biggest Swedish daily. He destroys people, the headline says, and he was compared to a dictator. And the story included very serious allegations, very detailed allegations like this. Maybe this was the worst. Theater director pressed actor to abortion for a role. Pressed actor to abortion for a role. The press council, this story received very serious criticism from the press council. The allegations were questioned by the press council as they were not proven. And the theater director and the theater only got 4 hours to answer. 4 hours. And this person, of course, went into a state of shock, and 4 hours is not enough to process this situation, of course. So this is something we have to learn from. And I would like to say that when we are doing these kind of confrontational interviews, we always have to think that we have dealing with human beings. So I will talk a little bit about how we are dealing with this. First of all, if a person, like this theater director, he denied an interview, but if a person denies an interview, that does not mean that you should give up the ambition to get response to criticism. You have to see it separately. Even if the person don't give you an interview, the person should have the right to respond to the criticism. So it's not the same thing. So we have a no surprise policy, which means that no one should be surprised of the content of the allegations in our program. And we have a 3-step model. The first step, we ask for an interview like everybody do, and we inform about the questions we're going to ask. And if an interview is denied, we come back with information about all the criticism and ask for comments with a strict deadline. That's important. And then in most cases, which also include persons who has given us an interview, of course, we send excerpts of the script, or at least very detailed information about the allegations we are going to publish with strict deadline. And of course, it's important to exclude quotes and details that can lead to sources when we're having this transparency. Okay, so why inform about the wording of the story? I think the arguments for this are strong. When the story is written, the context can make the allegations even more serious. And our experience says that when the subject of the investigation, the bad guy, realizes the full extent of all these allegations, of the seriousness of it, then something happens. Suddenly, this person wants to correct facts and sometimes even be interviewed by us. So we think this is a very important way of working, but it has its limits. There are reasons to wait until later, that's for sure. One reason could be that we have to hide the evidence we have for some reason. And most important, it is about the safety of the team and of the sources. So maybe when dealing with dangerous people, we have to wait until the late stage, maybe even the last minute, to contact the the bad guy, where the bad guy is really a bad guy. But that does not mean that you should not treat the bad guy accurate and fair, in an accurate and fair way. So I would like to quote what OCCRP, I mean, this great international organization, they are dealing with dangerous people all the time. And they stress that you have to be fair and accurate when dealing with dangerous people. Otherwise, they could suspect us be working and get payment for other criminals. So when dealing with dangerous people, we have to look out and we have to be accurate and fair also in those cases. And if you want more tips on dealing with dangerous people, I recommend this very handy article published by GIJN. Okay, third checkpoint, the line-by-line process, which for us really is what it's saying here, the survival kit for the investigative reporter. I mean, without line-by-line, you will make mistakes as an investigative reporter. And if you make mistakes, if you have factual errors in your story as an investigative reporter, you risk to very soon become an ex-investigative reporter. You cannot survive as an investigative reporter without line-by-line. That's obvious for me, at least. So here we have a session. On this picture, we can see 2 reporters and 2 editors, and one of the editors is acting as devil's advocate. And you can see a chocolate on the table, very, very important, because this is such a demanding work. And for us, it takes at least 1 day, 8 hours, because it's, 55-minute story on TV is around 1,000 lines in the script. So it's a lot of work. Sometimes when we have more complicated issues, sometimes we do a pre-line-by-line on the most difficult parts, because just to give it the time it demands. And also, we might even take help from outside experts to help us reviewing our conclusions or help us with fact-checking, in difficult fact-checking. And we have found that outside experts, it could be academic researchers, it could be lawyers or anyone, they are keen on helping us because they think what we're doing is very, very important. So it's haven't been any problems for us to get help pro bono. And the reporter is expected to be well prepared before the line-by-line by having all the documents available in order, and also to do a pre-line-by-line to make footnotes. And footnotes at the end of each script page. And I just give an example. Here is a story that starts with a woman saying she's driving 150 kilometers to her relative Dick, who is living in an institution. Footnote on that on Google Maps, and then we can see 150 kilometers to this place south of Gothenburg. Yeah, that's right. So this is the way we are working. Fact-checking demands total attention, but it can be hard to stay sharp during the whole day. Therefore, it's wise to start with the central and more tricky issues. And I think that every story, there's always something in a story that can be questioned and should be discussed. So I think it's good to start when we are alert in the morning, to start with those more central questions before we getting carried away with details, because line by line is very much into the details. So the big questions should be solved first. And these are just examples what we can talk about at the very beginning. All facts that could be verified should be verified. And I know that in some newsrooms, they have the policy of saying that, okay, we do a line by line, of course, but we only verify the important facts, the major facts and the conclusions. And well, I say that's better than nothing, of course. But for us, it's essential to make sure that we verify everything, even the seemingly harmless ones, because we know that every single mistake we make, even if it is a small minor mistake, will be used against us. by the subject of the investigation, and it will be blown out of proportions, and it could harm our reputation. So everything should be verified. And I'll give you an example. This is a young guy, a drug addict, who died at a treatment center, 21 years old, and Leon was his name. Our reporter interviewed the mother of Leon, Nancy, and she told our reporter, I called the treatment center 6 times and warned them, telling them that my son is in such a bad state that you have to look after him, you have to help him. Then our reporter said to Nancy, I have to verify everything in my story, so you must help me. Can you please call the telecom company and ask them for the telephone call log, so we can prove that you called 6 times. And Nancy did that, and we could show, we could see when we got the telephone log that she only called 5 times, 5. And then you say 6 or 5, does it matter? No, it doesn't. But if she only called once, then it would have mattered. And it is this meticulous approach that is so important when you are an investigative reporter, to verify everything. Okay, I would like to end up by talking about some lessons we have learned during all these years. And one thing is that I think is interesting with us journalists is that the reality is never good enough. It's like everything should be a little bit worse, a little bit bigger than it is in the reality. I cannot understand why it is like that, but that's the way we are. That's the mindset we have. So, for example, how many are many? Is it 10, 15, 20, 30, 50? I don't know. It's a question of opinion. So if you have 12 victims in a case of wrongdoing, in a story, if you have 12 victims, it can be very tempting to write, many people are affected, but that's an opinion. But if you write 12 people are affected, that's a fact. And I think that as an investigative journalist, you should have precision as your ambition. Precision, you have to be precise when it comes to numbers. And the same goes with sometimes we take one step too far in our conclusions without it is necessary. If, for example, you are covering a story, it's a story about a working place, working environment, if you have accidents of work and the company, the employer, you suspect they have not followed the safety rules, then it's very tempting to write the employer neglected the safety rules, but then you have to prove they did it deliberately. But if you write the employer did not follow the safety rules, then you are stating a fact. So that's the difference. And the same goes for the statements from victims who suddenly, very easily becomes the truth because you trust the victim, you love the victim, you like the victim so much that you not, again, question what the victim is saying. So if a person say to you, a case, he says, I remember nothing. And you have no reason not to trust him when he's saying that. But how can you verify that? So you have to write, he says he remembers nothing, because it's a fact, he's saying it. Or if you have a woman who's saying, the police didn't do anything to help me. And then it's tempting to write, the police didn't do anything to help her. But how can you verify that? Because they can always claim they have done something, at least. So you have to write, she says the police didn't do anything to help her, because that's a fact. And please don't rely on other media. They are probably wrong. It doesn't matter how trusted or respected the media is, they are probably wrong anyhow. So you have to check everything before you quote a colleague. This is just an example. We had a story about ISIS jihadists in Sweden, and then suddenly this news article popped up. 900 kilo was found on the South Riviera in a flat in Cannes. 900 kilos of explosives. That went into the script. But during the fact checking line by line, we found it was 900 grams, not 900 kilo. And 900 grams, well, it's not as good, of course, as 900 kilos. So we skipped that. finally now, not only line by line, also frame by frame. And this is so important, because photos, videos, graphics are often overlooked in the fact checking as they are not in the script. And the result can be disastrous. Like this example from our program, we made a story about construction workers, and this is a logotype of the construction workers helmet. But in fact, this is not the logotype of the construction workers, because you can see in the helmet something very fishy. It looks like an SS symbol, and it is an SS symbol. And it was published in national TV by Mission Investigate. And the reaction was, of course, a lot of headlines in other media, because we made this awful mistake of publishing a Nazi symbol. And how could that happen? Well, the graphic designer went to Google Image and picked this picture up to the left, which is a fake one, because he thought that was the best picture. Amazing that could happen, really. The last question, your line by line, is anything that still bothers you. Anything, how does it feel in the stomach? Something that gnaws you. And if not, then, but now is the last time to speak out if you have something to say now. And then now the reporter can sleep well, because now the reporter knows that everything is done that could be done to make sure that the story is bulletproofed. And if still mistake has been made, it's the responsibility firsthand on the editor. If it still goes wrong, the editor is responsible. And who was responsible for this serious mistake? It was me. I was the editor of this story. I watched the video in the editing room 4 times on the small monitor, and I also watched the story on a big screen, very big screen, and I didn't see this SS symbol in this helmet. It's amazing you can make a mistake like that. So I had to say to my newsroom, it was my fault. I have made some of the worst mistakes in the history of a line by line in my newsroom. It's my fault. I'm sorry. So such thing happens, but the least the public can expect of us is that we do everything we can to minimize the risk of making mistakes and and not being accurate and fair. And to sum it up, line by line, light, facts, verify everything, conclusions, examine the grounds, and thirdly, allegations, check the response. This is what you have to do in every investigative story you make. And the benefit, well, it makes the story closer to the truth, and that's what journalism is all about. It makes the story bulletproof, and that's, of course, so important. And it makes the story sharper, in fact. So, and by the way, you will not end up as the bad guy yourself. Not too bad. And if you want to make a contact, here is my email address. So with these words, I would like to leave over to Alinda. Are you there, Alinda? Yeah, I see you.
Yes, I'm here. Thanks so much, Niels. I see some questions coming in about sharing the presentation.
It will be,
workshop itself will be published, but the presentations will be shared as well.
Yeah.
Let's leave the other questions to Q&A and look at legal threats now. Let me share my screen. Great, so let's look at some of the most common legal threats and what you can do to protect yourself against them. So the first thing to realize is that you are operating in an environment that has become more and more difficult over the past decade. So currently 2 out of 3 people are living in countries that are highly restrictive or where free expression is at crisis levels. And the pandemic has only accelerated this downward spiral that was already happening. The pandemic has been used to introduce new rules that can be used to target journalists. It has been used to suppress critical information, and the situation generally has gotten much worse over the past year. So while At the same time, accurate and reliable and timely information is more important than ever. You are also much more likely to get into legal trouble as a result of your work. Now, what are some of the most common legal threats? If you look at our work, we see still that the bulk of our caseload consists of defamation cases. So civil defamation suits, or even criminal defamation cases where you would be prosecuted by the state. We've also seen an increase in slap suits, and what I mean by that we'll discuss in a little bit. We have also seen over the past few years an increase in journalists facing trumped-up charges. So they could be subjected to criminal investigations, for instance, on the basis of false accusations of tax evasion, money laundering, but states get quite creative. So the charges can be anything really. And this might, of course, lead to your arrest, to arbitrary detention, and to all sorts of other measures that state authorities have at their disposal when it comes to criminal cases. Then we see increasingly an effort made by states to control information that is shared online. And of course, that is particularly problematic in a country where internet is the last remaining platform for freedom of expression. So we see cybercrime laws being introduced and being used to target legitimate journalism. We see blocking of website, filtering, internet shutdowns. We also see online violence. So you could also become a victim yourself of all sorts of forms of online violence that we'll talk about in a little bit as well. Of course, there's surveillance as well, which will have implications for protection of your sources. There is an opportunity as well that states would abuse criminal laws that are available to target criminals, but that would be used to target legitimate journalism. So think about the use of false news provisions, propaganda against the state, terrorist propaganda, all sorts of national security provisions. And then we see satire also becoming a target for legal action once in a while, as well as copyright issues, and on occasion even the closure of media outlets. So there isn't enough time today to go into detail about all of these different legal threats that you could be facing, but we've worked with GIJN to prepare this guide that is published on their website, and you can find it here. And I really encourage that you take a look at it. It describes all these different most common legal threats. What are they, and what can you do to minimize the risk that you're confronted with legal action? It also links to a lot of very helpful resources out there published by a number of different NGOs that could help you mitigate any risks that you might be facing. Before we look in a bit more detail at some of these legal threats, there are a few things to keep in mind. The first thing is that however good your journalism is, or perhaps even because it is so good, you cannot reduce your legal risk entirely. Increasingly, we see journalists who have written very good stories being confronted with baseless lawsuits that are not aimed at vindicating a right. They're mainly aimed at making the lives of the journalists difficult, distracting them from their reporting and draining their resources. Another thing to keep in mind is that even if you win, litigation is very time consuming and it is very expensive. If you win, a claimant might be ordered to pay your costs, but will they? And will you have the financial means to pay for a lawyer in the first place? And then finally, one of the most important things to remember is that how you are attacked and how you defend yourself depends on the country you're in and the country you're sued. So while international human rights law provides some tools to face these challenges, it is always a very good idea to get local legal advice and understand what the situation is in the country that you're in. So let's look in a bit more detail at defamation. So both civil defamation suits, criminal defamation suits, slap cases. This is Mr. Cuenca. Mr. Cuenca is a Brazilian writer and journalist who became the victim of over 140 lawsuits after putting out one tweet. And that tweet criticized President Bolsonaro and pastors of the Universal Church. And these 140 lawsuits consisted of some criminal defamation cases, but mainly civil cases. And they were quite small claims that came before specific small claims courts. But the problem was the pastors initiated these cases in almost all of Brazil's different regions, except for the region where Mr. Cuenca lives. So if you think about the implication of that in practice, this would mean that Mr. Cuenca would have to attend in person each of these hearings in the cases or send a lawyer in these 140 cases. If he wouldn't do that, there would be a significant chance that he would lose these cases. And even if they were small claims, if you're facing 140 cases in total, of course, that would have a major impact. And that doesn't even take into account the amount of time that you would need to attend all these hearings in person and so on. So in that sense, it is a truly nightmarish scenario of the type of litigation that you could face. We started supporting Mr. Cuenca last year. And so as a result, in response to this coordinated strategy against him, we have come up with a coordinated response and made sure that Mr. Cuenca has lawyers in all of these places to defend him in each of these cases. So with the case of Mr. Cuenca in the back of our minds, let's look at what is defamation. There are various definitions of defamation, but basically it's spoken or written statement that injures someone's reputation. And in some countries, defamation is criminalized. So that means that a state authority can prosecute you and convict you potentially to a fine or even imprisonment for defamation. Now that is widely opposed, for instance, by the UN or by the African Commission, but unfortunately still quite a lot of countries have defamation on, criminal defamation on the books. Then slap suits that I mentioned before already. Slap suits are basically lawsuits without any merit. They have no basis in fact. They are designed to intimidate you and basically make sure that you spend all your time litigating a case while spending quite a lot of money on lawyers to make sure you're defended. There's typically quite a big imbalance between the claimant and the defendant. So we often see on the one side a powerful individual or a corporation, and on the other side a freelance journalist, for instance. Defamation lawsuits, of course, are very time-consuming, they're expensive. So what can you do to minimize the risk? First of all, everything that Niels just said. So making sure that you follow good journalistic principles, making sure that you're fair, that you're thorough, that you're accurate in what you publish. Carefully attribute quotes, check your facts, don't assume that anything that someone else has written is true. And from a legal point of view, one thing to keep in mind is that it really helps you to keep good records. You must be able to prove that what you've said is true and based on facts. So gather all your evidence and keep records of your research and save any documents, and do that in such a way that even a couple of years from now, it will still only take you 5 minutes to find what you need. So do it in a structured way. If you are using audio or video recording, try to obtain express written consent. There are, of course, circumstances where you might be doing undercover reporting, and that's not what I'm referring to. Generally speaking, try to obtain written consent and save that somewhere. Keep in mind that if you're republishing someone else's statement, you might be liable for that as well. And that applies to retweeting as well. So one of the things that Mr. Cuenca's case shows us is that you're at risk both when it comes to what you publish, but also what you tweet. So keep an eye on your social media as well. If you're giving your opinion, make clear that people understand that it's your opinion, that it's your subjective assessment, and that you're offering it in good faith. If you are considering publishing defamatory statements, keep in mind, you might have a right to report on it, but check beforehand with a lawyer in your jurisdiction, just to be sure. Finally, it doesn't hurt to be prepared. So check your liability coverage, consider having appropriate insurance in place so that if a slap case, for instance, happens, you will have the ability to continue working. Then looking at satire. So Mr. Cuenca's tweet was satirical in nature. He used a quote from a French philosopher and changed that a little bit, replacing the church and the state with Bolsonaro and the universal church. It's quite hard to translate, but basically it was satire. Satire is not very easy to define, but I've tried here anyway. Basically, it is different from defamation. It's not meant to be believed by the public. It is exaggerated. It is designed to attack and to provoke. It is biting social commentary. It often blends attack with entertainment. And satire is implicitly protected by international human rights law. For instance, it's been recognized as a protected form of expression by the European Court. But still, it regularly comes under legal attack, and often defamation is the legal basis for such cases. Now, what you can do to minimize the risk of getting in trouble after publishing a satirical piece is make very clear that it is satire. You can do that by looking at the tone of your article, the headline, including unbelievable elements or silly elements or outrageous things in the story. You can make sure that the reader knows this is not straight news. Think also about the context in which you're publishing, and think of the country that you're in and the audience. Think of the publication itself. For instance, is it a satirical blog? Then it will be clear much more quickly than if you publish in a regular newspaper, for instance. You can also consider using fictitious names. You can consider publishing quite quickly after the actual incident so that it is clear that your parody refers to that actual incident. And one thing to keep in mind is that a disclaimer will not always help you. So for instance, if you have a disclaimer in very small print at the bottom of your article, it may not help you avoid liability. Then moving on to false accusations. Journalists can be accused of all sorts of illegal activities, which can lead to your arrest, sometimes even a criminal conviction. And some journalists are detained for quite a long time without their cases ever going to trial. Others may spend years in detention for things that they didn't do. And think about all the measures that a prosecutor has to make the lives of journalists difficult. Think about asset freezes, or for instance, a travel ban. How will you be able to do your work when you're confronted with some of these measures? It will make it very, very difficult indeed. And in addition to that, these types of cases often go hand in hand with a smear campaign. And they are very effective at discrediting journalists and their work. You see this tactic applied often in instances where a journalist is reporting on matters of public interest, especially when that reporting undermines a state or a public figure or a powerful group in the relevant country. And a very good example of this is the case of Judith Ismailova, who you see pictured here. Judith is an award-winning journalist from Azerbaijan, and she has worked to repeatedly expose corruption involving the Azerbaijani presidential family. And as a result of that very courageous reporting, she has faced years of harassment and intimidation. And this culminated in her arrest in December 2014 on charges of inciting someone to commit suicide. So as you can see, states are quite creative in what kind of charges they come up with. This particular one was not very convincing, of course, and additional charges were later added, including illegal entrepreneurship, tax evasion, and abuse of power. And none of these charges had a basis in fact, and they were widely condemned internationally. Lots of NGOs spoke out about her cases. They were seen as politically motivated, but still, she spent quite a long time in prison. We supported Khadija in her criminal cases, saw them through to the end at the domestic level. Eventually, she was released, but it still took quite a few more years before the European Court of Human Rights said that her detention indeed was arbitrary and was aimed at preventing her working as a journalist. So looking at how you can minimize the risk of becoming subject to this type of accusation. This is quite difficult, minimizing that risk, but one thing that you can do is you can assess your risks periodically. You can look at where you are vulnerable and how you can increase your protection capacities to make sure that you are slightly more secure. So let me give you a bit more detail about that, because I recognize that might sound quite vague. So for instance, a vulnerability factor would be working alone, where you can be working as part of a team and spread the risk among your team. It would make you slightly less exposed. You could also think about, a lack of knowledge on what your legal rights are, or a lack of training in, for instance, keeping your information secure. And on the other hand, a protection capacity could be having had that training and knowing what you need to do. Another protection capacity could be having a protocol in place. So what happens if you get arrested? Who do you call? Who does what? Who knows, how to call a lawyer and get them to where you are? Another thing to think about would be, what is your network like, both nationally, at the national level, but also internationally? Do you have contacts in any embassies or with international NGOs that could speak out about your case? What is your network like in terms of national media and international media? Could they, publish about speak out about your case? Another thing to take into account is digital security. So if you think about the situation of a potential arrest, you will probably have your phone on you and maybe even your laptop. So think about what information is stored on these devices. If there's anything there that could put you at risk, make sure that you remove that. Make sure that you log out of all your accounts so that your information is not very easy to access. Be mindful also of what you share on social media and how that can be used against you potentially. Another very important thing is to understand your legal rights. So what you can and cannot be arrested for. What are your rights when you are detained? Do you have the right to call a lawyer, for instance? And do you have the right to have someone present when you're being interrogated? Finally, you can do a lot to prepare. You can think about other journalists who have been arrested in your country. What were the circumstances of their arrest? Where were they taken? How were they treated in detention? What state bodies were responsible? And on the basis of that, you can conclude, where would I be likely to be taken if I was arrested? Which lawyer would I call who has the right expertise, who has the right profile to take on a politically sensitive case? But then if you cannot avoid being arrested, what do you do when you are arrested? Of course, it would be a very stressful situation. So it is good to think about what you would need to do if it happens. One thing you can do is pay attention to what's around you. Where are you arrested? At what time? What are the circumstances? Are there any witnesses to your arrest? What reason is given for your arrest? So a police officer needs to tell you why they are arresting you and that they are arresting you. Have they done that? And so if so, remember the reason. This may be counterintuitive, but avoid photographing or filming your arrest. It might provoke the arresting officers, and it might result in your equipment being damaged or even you suffering physical harm. Keep a close eye on the officers involved. Do you see badges? Do you see names? Do you see unit numbers or departments? Can you remember their features so you can describe them later on? And if you become a victim of assault at the time of your arrest, keep a record of all your injuries, of hospital visits, of any treatment that you have received. And of course, again, try to remember who was responsible. If you don't know their names, try to, remember what they look like. If you are suffering, if you're receiving any threats, keep proof of these threats and make sure that you spread the word. For instance, in journalistic circles, but you can also go to the police, and you can also alert international media or organizations. Then looking at online violence, what you see here is a word cloud that was put together by the International Center for Journalists on the basis of a forensic analysis of the torrent of social media abuse that Maria Ressa has faced over a 5-year period. And this word cloud contains 100 of the most prevalent abuse terms in the tweets that ICIJ analyzed. And the size of the words reflects how frequent these terms were used. And you will probably have also seen this report published by ICFJ and UNESCO that examines online violence, in particular against women journalists, and describes it as the new frontline for journalist safety. And one of the main takeaways from this report is that online violence comes in many different forms. It can range from a DDoS attack on your outlet's website, hacking into your accounts, cyberbullying, dissemination of intimate images without your consent, all sorts of forms of abuse, death threats, rape threats, racist abuse, misogynistic abuse, etc. And it's very important not to underestimate the impact of this, both in terms of the fact that it can spill offline, it can translate into offline violence. It can also undermine you, your reputation. It can vilify journalism as a whole. It can help build this whole atmosphere within which it is very easy to persecute you, to prosecute you. So it should definitely not be underestimated. Now you'll see it's a very short list in terms of what you can do to minimize this risk, because that is very, very difficult. You can encourage your media organization to establish a protocol to be prepared, as it were. You can speak with family and friends about the risk you're facing in terms of online harassment. Like I said, a lot of content is taken from social media accounts. So attackers could also look to your families and friends' social media accounts and take content from there that they then use to target you. You can be careful with the hashtags you use so that you don't end up alerting coordinated troll attacks. You can be careful with sharing your live location as well. And then if it happens, how do you respond? When you would be attacked offline, when you're attacked online, you may want to take legal action in response to a violation of your rights. And one of the things that you could, for instance, do is file a report to the police. Before you can do that, it's very important that you make a permanent record of the online violence. And that's not a very pleasant thing to do, of course, to go through all of the hate that you've received and document the content of the messages, the date it was posted, who posted it, where was it posted, and to save that meticulously in such a way that you can find it later on. there are organizations that can help with this and that have developed, for instance, apps that make this less of a burden. It is important also to share threats with colleagues, with your editor, with your management, and to set up a procedure to protect your safety. It's also very important to seek support. It's not just words, it has a real impact on your well-being. So seek psychosocial support, get a lawyer who can advise you. You may think, you know, this is probably not something that can be prosecuted or that will ever be prosecuted, but perhaps flag it to a local lawyer and they might be able to tell you that even though you don't know what kind of specific provision this might fall under, they might have some ideas as to how it could be framed and presented to the police. If you then file a report with the police, don't be shy to follow up with them. They might be quite busy. They might not understand the seriousness of online violence. They might not understand the risks this violence poses for you. So do follow up and chase them. And if you have a lawyer, they will do that for you as well. You can also consider filing a report with the relevant platform if the content violates their terms of service. What might help is if you include a copy of the police report with that. Now, this all sounds pretty grim, of course, and these are only a couple of examples of the few most common threats that we're seeing. On a day-by-day basis, we see we meet a lot of journalists with different types of legal cases. And there is some hope, there is support available. So if you are confronted with legal action, do contact us, for instance, or other support organizations. We can connect you to a reliable lawyer. There is financial support available to cover your legal fees. There is pro bono legal support in certain countries. There are specialist organizations that can help you gather evidence. For instance, if you've suffered torture or assault in detention, if you have suffered an online attack, there are organizations that can help you document that evidence. There are international advocacy groups that can raise the profile of your case, trial monitoring groups that can make sure they keep an eye on the fairness of your trial. And there is all sorts of emergency financial support. So for instance, for a while you are unable to work because of the legal action you're facing, there might be support for that as well. We're part of a network of support organizations that work together and coordinate where possible to deliver support to journalists who might be in legal need. And that support can have a real impact in cases. So to give you some idea, over the past 10 years or so, we've supported more than 90 cases, helping hundreds of journalists in 110 countries. And together we avoided more than 290 years of detention. So some good impact can be had, and do reach out and seek support if necessary. You can do that via our website directly by completing our application form, but you should also feel free to email me using this email address. So that brings me to the end of my presentation, and I would suggest we now move into Q&A. Let me start with a question for Niels, if Niels is ready as well. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Yeah.
So Niels, one of the first questions that we had was if you can, you mentioned you can tell a true fact without telling the truth. And could you clarify what you meant by that?
What I meant is that the selection of facts is so important, because if you give accurate facts, but just describing one side of the picture, then this you will not give the full picture, which means that the story can end up being very misleading. So to include the relevant facts, that's something you have to do if you want to give a correct and balanced picture. And we have one question here, Alinda, that is aimed to you and to me, maybe too. When it comes to undercover reporting, what is the legal framework?
So that's a very good question. And I don't think we have the time to go into that in a lot of detail. There is some case law about that I would be very happy to share with you, and some specific standards that you could apply. But it also depends on the region you're in, what case law applies and so on. So I would recommend that you reach out to me after the panel, and I can then help you with that.
Another question is, why should you show the script for person if the person is guilty? And it's clear that this person is guilty. Yeah, that's a good question. But anyhow, even if you have all the evidence you need, you can prove that the person is guilty or something. I mean, to be fair, you always have to give this person a chance to respond to this allegation and give the best explanation. And also, even if you do that, there might be some facts in the story that are not accurate. So it can be very smart to let this person take part of all these details and react to them. And maybe then you will get some facts checked and corrected, because you and the bad guy might have something in common, namely that the facts published should be accurate, correct. Okay, and both our presentations will be uploaded, that's for sure. Alinda, may I ask you, Alinda, many investigative journalists have problems with London as the capital of libel tourists. Swedish journalists have it, OCCRP have had it. Can you say something about the risks of being accused of libel in London?
Yes, unfortunately, we see these cases come up as well in our practice. And what we always try to do is find a pro bono lawyer to advise these journalists. And fortunately, in countries like the UK or, for instance, the US, there are still lawyers who take cases pro bono, but it is quite difficult. And I can especially imagine if you don't live in the UK and all of a sudden you're sued there, that is quite a threatening situation. Journalists should feel free to reach out to us. We can always see what we can do to advise or to connect them to a pro bono lawyer.
Okay, that's good. I just see that maybe I should add to this question about showing the script. I don't mean that you physically have to show the script. I mean, you can read the script to this person, this bad guy. So you don't have to show the script. That's not what I'm meaning. Okay. Do you see any more questions, Alinda?
I saw one about online violence in Bangladesh in particular, about bots run by state intelligence causing the online violence. That is a very, very difficult situation. We have taken a case against Azerbaijan in a similar situation where we suspected it was the state behind the online violence. So if you then try to challenge that violence in the domestic courts, it is quite likely that you will lose these cases or that you won't get anywhere with these cases. What we've done there is to exhaust all domestic remedies, so litigate until the last available court at the domestic level before going to a regional court. Now in Bangladesh, of course, a regional court is not available, so that makes it a very, very difficult situation. And the only thing you can do is to try and somehow protect yourself from these attacks. But I recognize that is a very, very challenging situation, and it's not easy to do anything about that.
I see another question here. How, when it comes to questioning the victim, how can we do that without them feel like I don't believe them? Of course, my experience says that when it comes to the victims, that they expect of us to ask tough questions, as they expect us doing that as we are journalists, and I respect that it is in our profession to ask those questions. I don't see, in fact, I think they will be disappointed if you don't ask those relevant questions. But you, of course, you ask them in a polite way. That's important. You don't have to be aggressive to ask tough questions. You can do that in a very polite way, but they should be asked anyhow. And as I said before, both you and the victim will gain.
I think, Niels, that brings us to the end of our session. So thank you everyone for joining us, and apologies for the issues around sharing our presentation. Do feel free to reach out to us. Our presentations will be shared, and with that, our contact details. So we look forward to hearing from you.
Yes, thank you very much, everybody.